Good morning, everyone. This is Jason Dean at Film Fanatic. Hope everyone's doing good. It's Sunday, about 11:23. It's a nice, lazy Sunday morning slash moving into the afternoon. Hope everyone's doing good. So, yeah, I want to thank everybody again for their support. If you like and find my videos interesting, please, like and subscribe to my channel. It's been a blast. It's been cool. Like the last 5 days or so, I had about 10,000 new views. So, it's been great, and I've been getting a lot of videos and surprisingly so, as far as in regards to what movies that have been getting the hits. But I've been on a lot of the films that I've been doing where they're typically like the more horror exploitation oriented kind of thing, or kinds of things. The more underground films. I've been really surprised by the level of views that those videos have been getting. They've actually been performing higher than anything else. So I've gotten some a few videos where they've had about five or 6,000 views. So I really appreciate people checking out the stuff and wanting to sit through and listen to me talk about these movies that mean the world to me. So, and again, at the end of the day, it's all about it's not really about me. It's really about trying to bring light to some of these films that I've loved and I continue to love, and I love more and more with each passing year and each passing day. So I really appreciate the support, and so it's great. And so stay tuned. There's going to be more videos coming your way and more interview segments. And I talked about this special event that I'm going to be hosting. It's going to be the first kind of public event centered on Freddy vs. Jason. That's going to be coming up next month, and it's going to be basically a party that I'm hosting to kind of celebrate that film, and also kind of a culmination and the kickoff of this whole thing that I've been doing. So I really appreciate it. So today's show is going to be a little bit of a different thing. I'm going to try to make this video is all about soundtracks, film scores, and the composers that have created these iconic pieces of music, and also how they've influenced me, people that I really look up to as far as composers in the world, and the music, how a lot of these albums and compositions have, really, really influenced me, and it's something that I always go to, and it greatly influences my band Quantum, which, I've talked a lot about in other videos, but over the years that band has taken on a very different direction as far as the source of inspiration, or where I get my source of inspiration. The obvious, influences from, say, traditional albums, like that's always going to be a thing, and that's always going to be a source of inspiration. But it's gotten to the point where films and everything around films, the whole kind of complete universe of how a film was created and all of the aesthetics around it, that's emerged for me personally as even more of a bigger inspiration than anything else that you would kind of think of in a traditional sense. And it's so I've come into that realization more and more. And I've talked about, in my past where at one point I wanted to, put my hat in the ring as far as being a filmmaker, and I have some experience with trying that out and actually, doing some content and making some videos and creating some films, so I do have experience with that. But it's that whole need or desire for actually becoming, say, quote unquote, a filmmaker has definitely shifted and changed over the years, to where now that part of my brain, which is something I'm kind of obsessed about, and it's also something that I love more than really anything, but then it's also a real intense passion. But I've taken that kind of inspiration and that love for film and cinema and kind of that desire to create in that world. I've kind of, over the years, I've shifted it towards being able to take all of those influences and those desires and shift it into what has become quantum. And it's kind of an interesting, weird path that's been on. I started out many years ago. I was playing in this band, and I've talked about this in other videos, but my history as far as writing my own music has been going on, goes back quite a few years, and has really developed over the years and has really evolved and keeps continually shifting and changing. Before I was ever in, with my experience in playing music, for many, many years I played drums. My main instrument is drum set, but for many years I was essentially like a backup person. Or like a fill-in drummer, and I played for a long time, and I still do, but I played for a very long time, especially then, where it was more or less centered on that kind of thing. But I played for a long time with lots of different bands, and I was also part of a few bands where I was playing drums, but I didn't really have, say, creative input. I wasn't, contributing to the music very much. So I was really kind of the hired person to kind of play drums in these various projects, and most of the time, about 90% of the time, I was, usually given parts, or it was somebody else was kind of the captain of that ship, and I was essentially there to kind of hopefully provide, what they needed. And I did that for a very long time, and it was great. It was, I learned a lot. I had a lot of tremendous experience. And also, I had never ventured into the idea or even thought about creating my own music. And also, the other part was, as far as recording music, that was something that was very foreign to me. And for a long time, I didn't have an attraction to recording, but I had some good experiences with that, and I immersed myself in these certain situations. One of the things that was probably one of the best experiences I had, that really, it did eventually, at the time, it was very hard, and I didn't really enjoy it, but I threw myself into the situation to try to gain the experience. But when I went to Berklee College of Music, and one of the things that I did afterwards, after I got out of school, I wasn't sure where I was going to go. I wasn't sure if I was going to stay in Boston. Berklee is located in Boston, Massachusetts, and I grew up in New York, and then my family had moved to Maine, so I was kind of at this crossroads as far as where I wanted to go. I knew I wanted to try to do music to some capacity and maybe build, an eventual kind of, career out of it, but it was really hard. The competitive nature of the school was kind of overwhelming. Being in the city was very overwhelming, and it really was, on one side, it was one of the hardest experiences. It was almost like feeling like you're surviving a war or like some kind of firestorm, on one hand. So it really made me really question as to do I really want to do this, but then on the other hand, it's something I always need. I felt like even at that age or that time when I didn't have much experience, even though it was so overwhelmingly tough, I still had this desire and need that it's something I still need to do. Regardless of all of this, all of these, adverse situations that I was in. So on one hand, it was one of the hardest experiences, but on the other hand, I also regard that period as being, one of the greatest experiences. Going to school there and immersing myself in various situations and trying to soak up things like a sponge. So I look back at that as being also, one of greatest experiences ever. And I always had like an aversion to like recording in studios. And I was fortunate when some things happened that led to more positive things and a little bit more of a light at the end of the tunnel as far as, you know, maybe building a career. But one of the things that happened after school was I got hired by this producer who worked with a friend of mine who I knew, who was actually the producer on a lot of the classic Bob Dylan albums. He also worked on a lot of the Cream albums, worked with Eric Clapton, and did a bunch of records in the 60s and 70s. And I was really fortunate to be asked by him. His name was Buddy Revell, and I got asked by him to basically be a session guy for him. He had, he was up there in age at the time, and he was kind of at the, his career was, obviously sidelined. It was sidelined for a lot of different reasons, but he was still really active, and he was still doing lots of recordings, mostly, centered in here in Maine, obviously, and he was doing it as a little bit more of a side project, but he was still very active, and he worked at this really nice studio that used to be in Rockland with a friend, Glenn Dubois, who's an amazing musician and bass player, and he had a really amazing studio at the time called E-Space. And I got hired to basically be one of his drummers to work on all these various projects. And I started to record drums for lots of different bands that were coming through town. And it was incredibly hard, and I didn't know what I was doing, but I got through it. And, I knew working with somebody of that caliber would be a really great experience, and I made myself do it. And it wasn't until years and years later that I started to really discover how much I love recording. And now it's like one of my favorite things. Many, many, many years later, now I love recording. It's one of my, passions. So, and then also during that time when I said I was playing drums in various bands, it wasn't until I started this band with my then girlfriend, Full Contact Kitty, where, we were trying to create our own thing, create our own space, create our own sound. And that band was very much influenced by, bands like Sonic Youth and the Pixies, and I was really listening to a lot of like John Zorn, who was like an avant-garde saxophone player. And I was also, very much. That's kind of also the period of where I started to really get into films, and particularly I was really into David Lynch, and then I discovered Angelo Badalamenti. He became, my favorite kind of composer. So all those influence kind of, and then other groups I was really into and obsessed with were groups like Massive Attack. So this became this band, Full Contact Kitty, became, that those influences kind of really helped form that band. And we were doing all original music, and we also, I had this idea and concept after we had the band for a while to maybe do some kind of visual thing for the band. So I started to work with a group of other people and some friends that were, involved with the film industry and doing videos. And so we ended up shooting these videos that were eventually, finished, and we projected them on the band. And I got that kind of concept and idea from the Velvet Underground and all the work that they did at the factory with Andy Warhol, where they would project these images and videos that were shot, and even films. They were like projected on the band. So that my first experience working on film to a degree was then. And we shot a bunch of these videos, and then for 6 months to a year, when we were starting to kind of be active as a band, we used to, bring this projector and have these images broadcast on us as we were playing. And it was always kind of I always felt like it created a cool aesthetic. And, and it was just kind of evolved to more of a thing that I thought about more and more and more. After that, I ended up joining this other band with another friend called Tit City, which was a little bit more of a full-on electronic band. And that also had a real theatrical thing. We didn't really do the projection thing of video, but we also, we got into the visual thing. I started to use, also with Full Contact Kitty, we used to use like lots of masks and makeup and kind of a theatrical. We had this real theatrical flair to our music, and that kind of continued with Tit City. That band was even more of an electronic-based thing, or it was like more or less a fully realized electronic group. And Full Contact Kitty had that element. We were, very much into electronic music. It was right when LCD Sound System had just come out, and groups like Massive Attack, Portishead. So we always had that element to our music, but it was still traditionally more of a rock band. With Tit City, it moved into where it was a fully, kind of fully realized electronic group. But we did use live instruments. And during that time was when I had this real deep, passion. My thirst for films grew even more. I started collecting more and more movies, and I had these aspirations to kind of maybe venture into maybe trying to be a filmmaker. And I eventually directed this short film that was we had a release show around it. It was called Rapture. It was this short 20 minute video or movie, and it's kind of a piece of crap, but it was a great experience. It was a lot of work. It cost me a lot of money and a lot of time, and it gave me a deeper appreciation for film, because I realized how hard that medium is, and probably overall it's the hardest medium that there is, because of all of the hats that a person needs to wear to be able to make something successful. Whether you're editing, directing, scoring the film, just the cinematography, just everything, the marketing. So after I did that film Rapture, over the years I tried to do more projects. I tried to do other films, and nothing really took off. Nothing really kind of came to fruition as far as like having a real idea or a concept. I did have lots of starts and stops. I did write various drafts of scripts. I collaborated with a few different people with that, and at one point I had something that I felt was good, or that was pretty clear. And at one point we did start shooting. I had a little group of friends that I was working with, and also my girlfriend at the time had a passion for film, and so we were starting to actually shoot footage for this next project. But it never really, after we had, we shot 1 or 2 weeks before we took all of this footage. We had an assemblage of different actors and actresses, and it never really held any water after we had, finished that portion of it. It just fell by the wayside, and never really felt like there was something to kind of continue. It was nothing that we were really enthusiastic about. So it was all kind of put on the back burner and whatnot. And then years later, I started the Quantum Band, which was like my first time writing music, and also, trying to put together my own band that was going to eventually be a regular project. But I still had this deep love of film. And, I kind of went back and forth for a couple of years of like, well, I really would love to make another film, maybe make a full-length feature. I have this, real deep passion for film. During that time, I was really spending a lot of money and time and collecting movies and watching movies, going to the theater and reading about different directors, and it became more of a hobby. It went from like more of a hobby to like an obsession, and I was always like thinking about those kinds of things. And then over time, I started taking, those kinds of influences and those ideas, and I started putting it into Quantum. And then over a period of a few years, I realized that, oh wow, like I came to this crazy realization where I was like, oh wow, like this is kind of where I'm putting that energy. And suddenly the idea of being quote unquote like a filmmaker, or trying to direct a film per se, kind of went away, and I didn't really have the desire for that. But I found myself with Quantum was I was taking my influences by a film, whether they were, from the cinematography standpoint, from various directors, even the pacing of stories, the aesthetics, and especially soundtracks and film scores. I was taking all of those influences and kind of dumping them into Quantum, and suddenly I over a period of time I started to get a sense that I could hear and see those influences in Quantum, and then over time, people who were listening to our music also would kind of say that to me, and I was like, oh wow, like this is cool. It's a kind of a weird, different angle, but it was an obvious thing, and I found myself this band was satisfying that thirst to make films, and I was doing it in a I don't know, kind of a weird, unique way, and that's grown even more over the years since then. We've had the band for about 6 or 7 years now, and it's grown to an even higher level, and movies have become even more of a passion for me, and so now that's a my go-to thing most of the time for sources of inspiration. Every now and then I listen to a song or reflect on something that I've written, and I'm like, oh, okay, I can kind of hear this reference from, most people might not pick up on it, but a lot of the times in my own head I can pick up on references of, from certain films that I've seen, and like fairly recently I wrote a song that was very much influenced by um, the Lord of the Rings trilogy, the original, particularly the Fellowship. There was a song that I composed for the last album that was very much influenced by that, and many many examples of that. Movies like Alien and films like Blade Runner. I started to kind of hear those influences in my music, and I was like, oh, this is really interesting, and so, and even I was making references, even lyrically to a degree, to certain films, and so it just kind of evolved into this whole thing. So today's show is going to be all about film scores, composers, and film soundtracks that I have a deep love for, and that I feel are a huge influence for for what we do with our band Quantum. Kind of my go-to thing of like, that, every person, artist, always has, I feel like, a little well that they go to kind of replenish their system, and to kind of rehydrate them and give them a source of inspiration. And for me, that's what films are, and especially like film scores. But films overall are that thing for me too. It always inspires me. So I made a little list, a general list of certain films that just really moved me. The the one soundtrack that I remember when I first heard it years ago, and it just completely blew my mind away, and it just really made me look at soundtracks in a completely different light, was the soundtrack for Alien 3 that was directed by David Fincher. The film itself is okay. I think it gets a bad rap. It's not a great film, but it's the first film that was directed by David Fincher, who went on to become just an amazing, director. He's made such an incredible amount of films, Seven and Zodiac and Fight Club. So Alien 3 was like his first film. But the soundtrack for Alien 3, I just think, is one of the most terrifying and one of the most epic scores ever conceived for film. It was composed by Elliot Goldenthal, and that, his stuff, and this soundtrack in particular, became an obsession for me. Alien 3, I think it's easily the best film score for the entire franchise, and one of the greatest, uh, you know, scores ever. It's something. I mean, I equate it with Halloween. I used to always, when I bought it on CD many years ago, I used to always listen to it in Halloween, on around Halloween, the Halloween season. But it's really horrific. I mean, it's it's so intense, and it's one of those soundtracks I feel like it can really give you, it literally gives me goosebumps every time I listen to it. Just tremendous. Just an amazing film or soundtrack. The film not so much, but the soundtrack, the film score. I mean, Elliot Goldenthal has been around for many years, and I think it's definitely the best thing he's ever done. Just amazing. The other soundtrack that always has had a deep impact on me, one of my all time favorite film scores, also from the Alien franchise, the very first Alien, directed by Ridley Scott, Jerry Goldsmith. Completely different kind of tonality, and a completely different set of emotions, but Jerry Goldsmith composed the original score for Alien, and it's truly one of the most gorgeous compositions ever created for film. It really has this really it has this haunting quality. It's very melancholy, and there's all these great elements of horror. It's very minimalist, which I really love. I bought the Alien, and Alien will be definitely a film that I will do a show on here in the future. But I have a couple different editions of that film on DVD and Blu-ray, and I bought it on Blu-ray a couple of years ago. This newer edition, and it's got this amazing feature because you can actually listen to just the soundtrack and watch the film and turn off the dialogue, and it's amazing. Like I've done it quite a few times where I'll just play the soundtrack through my sound system, and it's pretty amazing. Like it's a truly magical composition and collection of music. And it's very melancholy. It's got this incredible. It's a very haunting. It creates this incredibly haunting mood, and it's got these elements of beauty, but then it's also very terrifying at the same time. Uh, just an amazing score. And also, James Horner did Alien 2, which is another soundtrack that I just think, and film score, which is just incredible. Um, James Horner is amazing. He went on to win all of these Academy Awards. He did the film score for James Cameron's Titanic, and also, Braveheart, which is another awesome movie. And they're both amazing film scores. But Jerry, James Horner did Aliens, the sequel that was directed by James Cameron, which is one of the greatest sequels in history of cinema. I mean, it's just amazing, just an incredible movie. I'm gonna eventually do a series on that film also. The other soundtrack that I just can never get enough of, and is always like a continue. It's always, I look at it as a continual source of inspiration, is Vangelis's film composition for Blade Runner. Just amazing, and to me, it's like the ultimate soundtrack to like a dystopian uh, existence. It's got this really dark underbelly to it, but then it's got this sense of isolation, and it's also incredibly beautiful, and it's got this unbelievable sensitivity around it. And that to me is, it might be my favorite composition for film, or my favorite soundtrack overall. But Vangelis was, just a legendary um, composer, and I feel like that movie is elevated by that music. It's so rich and so emotional. It just really heightens. I think for me, it might have been the first time I regarded film as being such a huge component to making a film great, and to making a film, or to give a film this lasting power that will be looked at and remembered forever. And I looked at it, that was the first film of where I looked at this, and felt that the music was a character in the movie, and was just so gorgeous and rich, and and without, I mean, the movie itself is so amazing anyway, but without the film score, like it was such an integral part to me. It was just as important as like the great script and the great acting and the great amazing cinematography and the masterful direction by Ridley Scott. And also, one of my favorite composers of all time is Ennio Morricone, the great Italian composer from Italy, who is mostly well known for all of the great spaghetti westerns in the late 50s, 60s, and 70s. He did all of this, all of all of the legendary spaghetti westerns with master director Sergio Leone, starring Clint Eastwood. Just amazing. I love that stuff to no end. Probably my favorite work that Ennio Morricone's ever done is probably for The Thing of John Carpenter's epic sci-fi movie, probably the greatest horror sci-fi movie ever made, and that the music that he composed for that is just truly haunting and just completely horrific and so ahead of its time. That's like one of my go-tos. I can never get enough of that album and that movie for that matter. I had gotten probably about 3 or 4 years ago. I had gotten a collection of all of Ennio Morricone's films that he did in Italy for all of the classic spaghetti westerns, and that package and that box set, it was a full box set of all of his work, and just amazing. And unfortunately, my car had set itself on fire, and that album and collection and box set went up in flames, and I lost it forever. So it's something I'm gonna have to eventually get. The other composer that has had such a deep impact on me and is such an influence is Brian Eno. Got his start with Roxy Music, which I love. I love that period too. And then he put out that amazing album, Cool to Warm Jets. And then he ventured into doing more ambient music and minimalist stuff. And he also like did some compositions and did some film scoring things, especially for this movie that I covered, which is a documentary called For All Mankind, which is about the first Apollo mission. And for me, that might be probably my favorite thing that he's ever done. That's just the most incredible collection of music, and the most it's so sublime, and it's so deep, and it's so reflective, and it's so minimalist, but it's just so gorgeous. It's one of those soundtracks or film scores that almost like brings tears to your eyes, or to my eyes, because it's just so serene and so gentle but beautiful, and but then it's also haunting. And the other album of his that's always my go-to album is Music for Airports. Just one of the most gorgeous albums ever. But Brian Eno has always been, overall, anything that he's done on so many different levels has always been an influence. But it's those two albums, especially, that are probably the biggest influence on me as far as writing music and things of that nature for what I do with Quantum. Just amazing. And he's one of those composers, especially when he moved into the electronic world, where he says so little with so few things. He's very minimalist, but the way he's able to articulate certain kinds of tonalities and his sense of melody is just beyond description. Just one of the greatest musicians, artists, composers ever. To see the light of day, and he continues to be incredibly prolific and just amazing, just a constant source of inspiration. And and again, there's so many other things that in the film score world that are my favorites or that are always a continuous inspiration. The other movie and soundtrack that has always meant the world to me and will always mean the world to me, and probably it's a tough choice, but to say who is your favorite composer or or your favorite film score, it's like kind of picking your favorite movie. But Angelo Badalamenti is probably is my favorite composer of all time. He's worked with the legendary David Lynch on all of his films, and I think my favorite works by his of his that was used for David Lynch or that are in David Lynch films is Twin Peaks, the original series, the original series. That to me is the most haunting and also horrific, um, and yet beautiful collection of music ever. He completely uses this idea of like juxtaposition in his compositions that I feel like is unparalleled. Where he's able to like capture so many different emotions, in one setting of where it's like where you can feel this sense of dread and beauty and wonder and have this like childlike and be immersed in this childlike, kind of dreamlike state, but then it's also this this nightmare like you feel is or these dark clouds are moving in and there's darkness approaching or darkness underneath that's slowly building its way to the surface. Just just amazing, just amazing. He's probably overall, and then the other soundtrack and film. My favorite David Lynch film is Blue Velvet, and he also did the music for that. And that's that's that might be my favorite soundtrack of all time. I mean, it's so hard to say. I know I've mentioned other people and other composers, but that might be my favorite soundtrack of all time. Just again, Angelo Badalamenti had such a has such an influence on me, but his range of how it can be this. You feel like as a listener, and for that matter, as a viewer of David Lynch's films, you're in this dreamlike state, and it's beautiful and gorgeous and lush, and you have this sense of love, but then it has this incredibly dark underbelly to it, and there's like all these horrific elements, and it just has this juxtaposition between darkness and light, and I just love how he is able to have that juxtaposition kind of sustained in all of his compositions. Like, unlike any other composer that I know of that's able to, and he has such a unique style and sound. Just, just incredible how he was able to, have this fully realized juxtaposition where where things can kind of go either way. Um, And then lastly, probably another composer that is, another one it's so hard to say, but arguably my favorite composer is, right up there with Angelo Badalamenti. Um, and just somebody I always listen to and go to, and is this Icelandic composer Johan Johannesson, who he just like last within the last few years passed away, and he was from Iceland, and I think he might be one of the I mean he's easily one of the greatest composers ever, but just unbelievable. I mean the music that he's composed, in particularly around he did the score and composition, all the compositions and the music for this movie starring Nicolas Cage in 2018 called Mandy, which I think is truly like the most haunting thing I've ever heard. It's super psychedelic, it's super trippy, it's super dark, it's real ambient. It's such a masterpiece of a film unto itself, and it was directed by Panos Cosmatos, and it stars Nicolas Cage. But Johannesson composed the music for it, and it is truly out of this world. It's definitely the most one of the most haunting things I've ever heard. And again, it's similar in some ways to what uh, Angelo Badalamenti has done, where he uses this vast, kind of, he has this huge tapestry, and he has this like juxtaposition, where there's all this light and beauty, but then there's all this darkness, and how he's able to balance all of those things. And just remarkable, just remarkable. And he is one of my all-time favorite composers. Johannes Johannesson also has worked a lot on most of a lot of other films that I really really love. Just tremendous. The Sicario is one of the greatest movies that's come out in many years. He also did the work for that. Sicario is incredible. It was directed by Denis Villeneuve, this Canadian director who's just amazing, an amazing director who, just recently or last year directed the latest adaptation of Dune, which is just an incredible film. And Johannesson directed, or actually composed, has worked right up until he passed away, which was such a sad thing when that happened. He composed most of the films for Denis Villeneuve. He did the Sicario, which I think, like I mentioned a few seconds ago, just an amazing piece of work. He also did The Arrival, which is just one of the greatest science fiction movies ever made. He composed for The Enemy, which is another incredible movie that he did. Uh, just amazing. I believe he worked on Prisoners, another wonderful movie of his. But Mandy is probably my favorite. That is just that movie is just one of the greatest movies ever, and the 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 compositions that Johan Johannesson created for that in the film score is just it's a whole nother world of sound and sight and sound, and the just the amazing level of juxtaposition of the light and darkness is just unparalleled. Just truly a magical experience when you are immersed in it. So this is Jason Dean. I wanted to do this show to try to talk about strictly compositions and film scores and soundtracks, and especially composers that I really really admire and I really really love. So this is kind of a celebration of that, and trying to talk more and more about that. The other one, which I should not leave out, but one of the other artists that I really, really love and look up to is Trent Reznor. I've been a huge Nine Inch Nails fan for many, many years since I was a kid. But it was when he, he moved, when Trent Reznor moved into the world of being more of a composer, when he did The Social Network with David Fincher, and then also before that, he also started this other side project called Ghosts. Well, it's actually part of Nine Inch Nails, but he put out these series of albums called Ghosts, which is like a collection of all these instrumental works that he put out. That's just amazing, like just such incredible electronic music. And then he eventually did the film score for The Social Network, David Fincher. It's a movie that's essentially about Facebook. Just an incredible, one of the most amazing soundtracks ever. And since then, he's worked with David Fincher quite a bit. He's worked with him on Gone Girl, which is just an amazing film, and the soundtrack and the work that he put into that film is just amazing. And he's worked with him since then, and just amazing. He's definitely one of the biggest influences on me, and somebody I always go to. And as much as I love like the old school Nine Inch Nails, I almost love the period of where he's moved into doing the more ambient stuff, and mostly like they're mostly instrumental based pieces, like with Ghosts and especially these soundtracks that he's done and his collaborations with David Fincher. Just amazing, amazing. So this is Jason Dean. So thanks again for your support, and we'll see you next time. Have a great day. Peace.